Hi everyone, welcome to my Lake Halter sew-along. This is my newest sewing pattern that I released over on Etsy, and as you can probably tell from the top that I'm wearing and the name itself, this is a halter neck pattern. But it includes a unique feature at the neckline with an overlapping shoulder detail. I really wanted to design a piece that could be worn all throughout summer, and depending on your fabric choice and styling could be dressed up or down. So that's why this pattern includes 4 different views. It has the classic top, which is what I'm wearing right now, with a little ruffle hack that I'll show you how I sewed. There are also 3 different dress views. There is a classic mini version, which is fun and flirty, perfect for hot summer days. There is the midi version with little side seam slits for ease of movement. And maybe my favorite version, which is the maxi dress view with a dramatic gathered tier that still feels super wearable all summer. Other than the little hidden overlap feature at the neckline, my second favorite thing about this pattern is the construction. I made sure for it to be beginner friendly and entirely serger-free for those of you who love pretty insides or don't have a serger. For fabric, I really recommend a woven with some drape to it, for example this wash linen that I'm wearing right now. As with all of my other patterns, I've included print at home, Copyshop, and Projector files, so whichever you're using, you are covered. With this video tutorial, I won't show you how to sew all 4 views separately. Unfortunately, that's one too many Lake halters, even for me, but I will be showing you each component and each step that you'll need to assemble the view that you pick. So with that, let's get started. Before sewing anything, let's start by stay stitching the neckline and armholes on the front and back pattern pieces. Use a long stitch length between 4 and 5 so that they're easy to remove later on, and stay stitch within the seam allowance, which is 0.5 centimeters or 1/4 inch. I know it's really tempting to skip this step, but don't do it. The stay stitching is going to keep your curves from stretching out when you're attaching the binding later on. Next, we need to stabilize the center back for our placket. Fold your back pattern piece in half, right sides together at the center back notch. Align the armholes and the side seams and press the center back fold from the neckline down to the underarm level. Once you have your center back marked, you can place your fusible interfacing on the wrong side of the dress. Use plenty of steam to activate the glue on the fusible interfacing and make sure it stays perfectly straight along that center back line. Now let's make the button loop. Fold the button loop piece in half along the long edge, right sides together. Sew using 1/2 centimeter or 1/4 inch seam allowance from the folded edge. Then you're going to trim the seam allowance to reduce the bulk and help you overturn the loop right side out using either a loop turner like I'm showing you here or a needle and thread. Press the little loop flat, then shape it into a loop and press again. We're going to find our center back fold on the back pattern piece again, and mark a horizontal line 1/2 centimeter or 1/4 inch down from the back neckline. Place your button loop right below this line and position the raw ends slightly to the left of the center back line. Sew the loop down along the center back line using a shorter stitch length of 1.5 to 2 to keep everything secure, and trim the loop ends down to about 0.3 centimeters or 1/8 of an inch. Place your fabric placket piece on top of the center back line, right sides together. Use pins to help you keep it in place and sew the placket down along the marked box. Once again, you'll want to use a shorter stitch length so that it's easy for you to pivot accurately at the bottom of the box. Now carefully cut down the center line of the placket, stopping 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch away from the bottom edge. Then you'll want to cut diagonally into each corner, cutting as close to the corner as possible without cutting through the stitching line. You will be cutting the stitches holding your button loop, but don't worry because it's already secured by the box that you just sewed. Next, turn the placket towards the wrong side of the back and press. Fold the raw edge of the placket under itself so that it touches the seam line you sewed in the previous step. Then top stitch around the folded edge as close to the fold as possible using roughly 1/2 centimeter or 1/4 inch seam allowance. This is what your placket will look like from the right side and the wrong side. We're going to set the back pattern piece aside and sew the bust darts on the front pattern piece. Fold the fabric right sides together at the dart legs, matching them up exactly. Pin the dart in place, then sew from the side seam towards the tip of the dart without back stitching. If you're using a more structured fabric and you're finding that you're having pointy bust darts, try curving the tip of the dart towards the folded edge instead of sewing the dart as a completely straight line. Leave longer thread tails and tie them into a secure knot. Press the bust darts towards the waist. If you're making the top, the mini, or the maxi, we'll be sewing the side seams now using French seams. Pin your front and back side seams wrong sides together first and sew using 1/2 centimeter or 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now turn the garment wrong side out so that the right sides are together. Sew the side seams again, this time using 1/2 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance to fully enclose the raw edges. Lastly, press your beautiful French seams towards the back of the dress or top. If you're making the midi dress with side seam slits, pin your side seams wrong sides together from the underarm to the notch. You'll want to sew using 1/2 centimeter or 1/4 inch seam allowance until you're about 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch away from that side seam notch. Switch to a shorter stitch length of 1.5 to 2 to keep everything secure. Then pivot and sew diagonally towards that notch, which is 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch away from the raw edge. Next, cut diagonally into the seam allowance right towards the notch, but do not cut past the stitching. From the underarm to the side seam slit, trim the seam allowance slightly so that no threads are peeking out later. Press the seam allowance to one side. Then turn the dress right sides together and poke out the little diagonal corners at the slits. Starting from the side seam slit, sew towards the underarm using 1/2 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Next, we're going to be pressing the seam allowance of the side seam slit open. The seam allowance here is 1.5 or 5/8 of an inch. You'll also want to press the small diagonal corners at the top of the side seam slit under itself. Then to fully finish the side seam slit, we're going to be pressing the raw edges of the seam allowance under itself, just like we did with the placket. Sew down the folded edge as close as possible using 1/2 centimeter or 1/4 inch seam allowance, and you can optionally also add a bar tack at the very top of the slit for extra strength. Next, let's prepare our armhole and neckline bindings for all views. Press the binding pieces in half, wrong sides together. Open them up, then press both raw edges towards that center crease. Lastly, fold the entire binding in half again and press. Essentially, we've just made double fold bias binding. To attach the armhole binding, unfold the binding and pin the raw edge to the armhole curve, right sides together. You'll want to have some extra binding at the top of both the front and back neckline. As you're pinning and sewing, lightly stretch the binding around the curves, but do not stretch the armhole itself. Sew directly in the first fold of the binding. This will be slightly more than 1/2 centimeter or 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then press the binding up and away from the bodice. I find it really helpful to lightly trim the seam allowance here because it will give me a much cleaner finish when I'm folding the binding over, and it will also help ensure that I'm catching the binding on the wrong side when I'm top stitching it from the right side. Next, fold the binding over to the wrong side of the armhole. It will wrap around the raw edge of the armhole and it will be folded back into quarters. Use pins or clips to keep it in place. Then from the right side of the garment, top stitch as close to the folded edge as possible, roughly at 1/2 centimeter or 1/4 inch seam allowance. Go slow and make sure that your stitches are catching the binding on the wrong side. Next, trim the excess binding off the armhole so that it matches the original angle of the neckline. Then overlap the back neckline on top of the front neckline, matching up the notches. Baste this overlap together using 1/2 centimeter or 1/4 inch seam allowance, and you'll want to repeat it for both sides of the neckline. Now attach your neckline binding using the exact same method as we did for the armholes. Starting from the center back, pin the bias binding around the neckline, stretching slightly as you're going around the curves. Sew in the first fold of the binding with roughly 1/2 centimeter or 1/4 inch seam allowance. At the center back, trim the excess binding just enough so that you have about 1.5 centimeter or 5/8 of an inch excess. Once again, it's really helpful to trim your neckline seam allowance slightly before flipping the binding over to the wrong side. Fold the little extra binding on itself, wrong sides together to hide the raw edge. Now we're just repeating what we did for the armholes, so we're going to fold the binding to the wrong side into quarters and pin. Then we're going to sew from the right side as close to the edge as possible using 1/2 centimeter or 1/4 inch seam allowance, making sure to catch the back of the binding as we're sewing. If you're sewing the top, the mini, or the midi dress, we're going to finish the hem. Fold the raw edge of the hem to the wrong side twice by 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. Sew it down with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and your top, mini, or midi dress are complete. But if you're sewing the ruffles, we have just a few more steps. I'm going to show you how to attach a mini ruffle to the top view, but if you're sewing the maxi dress with the gathered tier, the steps are exactly the same, just on a much bigger scale. Place your 2 ruffle pieces wrong sides together. Sew the side seams using 1/2 centimeter or 1/4 inch seam allowance. As we've done before, press to one side, trim the seam allowance slightly, and turn right sides together. We're going to sew the side seams again using 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance to create a French seam. press the side seams towards the front ruffle. Before attaching the ruffle, I also like to finish the hem. Fold the raw edge towards the wrong side by 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch twice. Sew the hem using 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Next, we're going to be sewing our gathering stitches for the ruffles. Find the middle of each ruffle panel by folding it in half and cutting a small notch. Then, set your sewing machine to its longest stitch length between 4 and 5 and drop the tension. Without back stitching, sew your first row of gathering stitches around the top edge of the ruffle at 1/2 centimeter or 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then sew a second row of gathering stitches beneath it at 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch seam allowance. Pull on 2 of the threads to gather the ruffle until it matches the width of the dress hem. To attach the ruffles using French seams, pin them wrong sides together, matching the side seams and the center notches. To reduce bulk, we'll want to make sure that the ruffle seam allowance is pressed forward and the dress seam allowance is pressed towards the back. Distribute the gathers evenly and sew with a regular stitch length using 1/2 centimeter or 1/4 inch seam allowance, and trim the seam allowance in half to reduce bulk. Next, as we've done with all our previous French seams, we're going to turn the dress right side out so that the right side of the ruffle and the dress are facing each other. Take the time to make sure that your gathers are still evenly spread out, and sew with 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance to enclose the raw edge of the ruffles completely. Lastly, for our final step, we're going to line up our back placket and attach our button. And that's it, your Lake Halter is now complete. I hope you enjoyed sewing along and that you found this tutorial helpful. I would love to see your finished Lake Halter, so please remember to tag me when you're posting on social media and use the hashtag Lake Halter so that other sewists can get inspiration as well. See you next time!